The massive metal doors of the Zephyrian analysis chamber slid open with a soft hiss. Chief Analyst Vextar looked up from his workstation, his 4 eyes blinking rapidly as Admiral Kethavar entered the room. The Admiral's bioluminescent patches were flashing bright orange, a clear sign of extreme agitation. "Tell me you have found an error in the translation," Kethavar demanded, his voice echoing off the chamber's curved walls. "Tell me that what we discovered about the human vessel was some kind of mistake." Vextar's tentacles curled nervously around his data pad. He had been working for 3 full cycles without rest, checking and double-checking every piece of information they had gathered from the deep scan of the human warship. The USS Defiance had left their space days ago, but the nightmares it had left behind were still growing stronger. "I wish I could, Admiral," Vextar replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But every translation has been verified. Every data point has been confirmed. What we found about the humans is real." The Admiral's patches dimmed to a sickly yellow color. He moved closer to the massive display screen that dominated the center of the chamber. Images and text from the human ship's database scrolled across the surface in endless streams. Most of it looked harmless enough at first glance. Personal messages between crew members, technical reports about engine maintenance, medical records showing routine health checkups, but beneath the surface lay something that had shaken the Zephyrian High Command to its core. "Show me the command logs again," Kethavar ordered. Vextar manipulated his control panel with practiced movements. The screen changed, displaying the personal records of Commander Jake Morrison, the human who had spoken with them during their brief diplomatic contact. Morrison had seemed so calm during their conversation. He had smiled often and spoke in friendly tones about peace and cooperation between their species. The scan had revealed a very different picture. Morrison's command logs contained detailed records of something the humans called their military history. Page after page of conflicts that spanned thousands of their years. Wars that had lasted for decades. Battles that had killed millions of their own kind. Weapons that could destroy entire cities in seconds. "Look at this entry," Vextar said, pointing to a specific section of text. Morrison writes about something called the Battle of Gettysburg. Over 50,000 humans died in just 3 days of fighting. But listen to how he describes it. The alien's voice took on a mechanical tone as he read the translation aloud. "A turning point in our civil war that demonstrated the resilience of democratic ideals and the terrible cost of divided purpose. The sacrifice of those who fell reminds us that freedom requires eternal vigilance." Kethavar's patches flickered rapidly. He speaks of 50,000 deaths as if it were a lesson to be learned, not a tragedy to be mourned. "It gets worse, Admiral." Vextar switched to another section of the database. "The humans have something they call the Geneva Convention. It is a set of rules they created to limit their own behavior during warfare." "Rules to limit themselves?" The Admiral's voice rose, in pitch. "What does that mean?" "It means, sir, that their natural way of fighting was so brutal that they had to create laws to stop themselves from doing it." Vextar's tentacles were shaking now. These rules forbid things like targeting medical facilities, torturing prisoners, and using certain types of weapons. The very existence of such rules implies that without them, humans would do all of these things as standard practice. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the computer systems. Both aliens stared at the screen, trying to process what they were seeing. In all their years of studying galactic civilizations, they had never encountered anything like this. Most species fell into predictable categories when it came to warfare. The Thorian Empire fought with cold efficiency but no passion. The Valdris Collective used swarm tactics but avoided prolonged conflicts. The Crystalline Hegemony preferred defensive strategies and rarely engaged in offensive operations. Humans seem to have no such limitations. "There is more, Admiral," Vextar continued reluctantly. "The ship's medical officer, Dr. Lisa Carter, has extensive files on something called combat stress. Apparently, humans suffer psychological damage from participating in warfare, yet they continue to fight with devastating effectiveness. They are damaged by their own violence but continue to practice it?" "Yes, sir." Dr. Carter's notes describe therapy sessions with crew members who have nightmares about previous battles. They experience what humans call guilt and trauma from their actions during combat. Yet their service records show that these same individuals performed with exceptional skill and bravery. Kethvar moved to another workstation and began pulling up additional files. What about their weapon systems? What did the scan reveal about their military technology? Vextar's patches turned a deep purple, the Zephyrian equivalent of fear. Admiral, the USS Defiance is classified as a light cruiser by human standards. According to their technical manuals, it is primarily designed for reconnaissance and patrol duties. And our military analysts have concluded that this reconnaissance vessel could single-handedly defeat our entire border fleet. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The Zephyrian border fleet consisted of 47 warships, each one considered a masterpiece of their military engineering. The idea that one human scout ship could destroy them all was almost impossible to comprehend. "Show me their weapon specifications," Kethvar ordered. The screen filled with technical diagrams and performance statistics. Even translated into Zephyrian mathematical concepts, the numbers were staggering. Energy weapons that could punch through their best armor plating, missile systems with ranges that exceeded their own sensor capabilities, defensive shields that could withstand direct hits from their most powerful cannons. "But this is just a patrol ship," Vextar repeated. "Their database contains references to battleships, dreadnoughts, and something called a fleet carrier. If this small vessel possesses such capabilities, what must their true warships be like?" Neither alien wanted to think about the answer to that question. "There is something else, Admiral," Vextar continued. "The cultural files prepared by their xenobiologist, Dr. Helen Brooks. She has compiled information about human military philosophy for diplomatic purposes." "What kind of philosophy?" "They have an ancient text called The Art of War that still influences their military thinking after thousands of years. It contains strategies for defeating enemies through deception, misdirection, and psychological manipulation. But that is not the disturbing part." "What is?" "The disturbing part is that they study this text not as a historical curiosity, but as a practical guide. Human military officers are required to read it as part of their training. They have turned warfare into a science, Admiral. They analyze their victories and defeats with the same precision they use to study stellar mechanics." Kethvar sank into his command chair, his bioluminescent patches dimming to almost nothing. "What have we encountered, Vextar? What kind of species develops such capabilities?" "I believe, sir, that we have encountered a species that has evolved, specifically for warfare. Not in the way that predators evolve to hunt prey, but in a way that is far more terrifying. They have evolved to fight their own kind." The implications of this statement settled over both aliens like a heavy blanket. Most galactic species had evolved from either herd animals or solitary hunters. Their approaches to conflict reflected these origins. But humans seem to have evolved from something entirely different. Their own historical records show continuous warfare among their own species for millennia. Vextar continued. They have fought each other with every weapon they could create, in every environment they could reach, for every conceivable reason. And through this constant conflict, they have become something that the galaxy has never seen before. What do you recommend, Chief Analyst? Vextar looked at the data streaming across his screens one more time. Personnel files showing human soldiers who had served in multiple wars. Technical manuals describing weapon systems that existed purely to destroy other weapon systems. Cultural analyses that revealed a species that had somehow learned to take pride in their capacity for controlled violence. I recommend, Admiral, that we pray to whatever powers watch over us that Commander Morrison was telling the truth about wanting peace. The soft blue glow of the analysis chamber's emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the walls as Vexitar worked through the night. Sleep had become impossible since they had begun studying the human data. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw images from the USS Defiance's database. Images of human warfare that defied everything he thought he knew about civilized behavior. Admiral Kethvar had left hours ago to brief the High Command, but Vextar remained at his station. There was too much information to process, too many disturbing revelations hidden in what seemed like routine ship records. The humans had not tried to hide anything during their scan. They had allowed the Zephyrians complete access to their databases, apparently seeing no threat in sharing their information. That openness, Vextar was beginning to realize, was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. He pulled up a new file, one that had been buried deep in the ship's personal records. Dr. Lisa Carter, the vessel's counselor and psychological specialist. Her job was to maintain the mental health of the crew during their long missions in deep space. At first glance, this seemed like a normal and caring profession. Most advanced species had some form of mental health support for their explorers and workers. But as Vextar read deeper into Dr. Carter's files, he discovered something that made his tentacles curl with anxiety. The woman had extensive experience treating what humans called combat stress disorder and post-traumatic stress syndrome. Her personal logs detailed therapy sessions with crew members who had participated in something called the Siege of Kepler Station. The descriptions were clinical and professional, but the implications were horrifying. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of survivor guilt following the successful defense of Kepler Station, one entry read. Continues to experience nightmares about the necessity of targeting escape pods during the final assault. Recommended continued therapy and light-duty assignment. Vexatar had to read the entry 3 times before he understood what it meant. The humans suffered psychological trauma from their military actions, yet they continued to perform those actions with devastating effectiveness. The crew member in question had apparently destroyed escape pods filled with enemy survivors, an action that violated every concept of civilized warfare the Zephyrians understood. But the truly disturbing part was not that the human had done this. It was that he felt guilty about it afterward. Most galactic species fell into 2 categories when it came to violence. Either they felt nothing when they killed, like the cold-blooded Thorians, or they were paralyzed by the emotional weight of taking life, like the peaceful Valdris. Humans seemed to occupy a middle ground that should have been impossible. They were deeply affected by violence, yet they remained capable of extreme brutality when they believed it was necessary. Vextar opened another file, this one containing the personal logs of Captain Ryan Brooks, the commanding officer of the USS Defiance. The entries revealed a mind that thought about warfare with casual efficiency, while simultaneously showing deep concern for the welfare of his crew. Lost 2. Good people today during the pirate engagement, Brooks had written after a recent skirmish. Rodriguez took a plasma bolt to the chest while manning the port guns. Martinez was caught in the engine room when they breached our hull. Both died doing their duty, but that doesn't make it any easier to write letters to their families. The B. Entry continued with tactical analysis of the battle, noting mistakes that had been made and improvements that could be implemented for future engagements. Brooks discussed weapons efficiency, shield rotation patterns, and crew performance with the same detached professionalism that a scientist might use to describe a laboratory experiment. Yet interspersed throughout the tactical discussion were personal observations that revealed a man genuinely grieving for his lost crew members. Rodriguez had just gotten engaged to that teacher on Earth Station, Brooks wrote. Was planning to request a transfer to civilian duty after this tour. Martinez was saving up to buy his parents a house on Mars. These weren't just numbers on a casualty report. They were good people with dreams and families and futures. Vextar found himself reading the entry multiple times, trying to understand how a single individual could simultaneously view warfare as both a technical problem to be solved and a human tragedy to be endured. The captain's ability to function effectively while carrying such emotional weight seemed almost superhuman. But perhaps that was exactly the point. He opened the next file, which contained engineering reports from Lieutenant Commander Amy Johnson. Her job was to maintain the USS Defiance's weapons and defensive systems. Her technical logs were filled with routine maintenance schedules, power consumption analyses, and equipment upgrade recommendations. At first, nothing seemed unusual about the reports. Any starfaring species would need to maintain their ship systems during long voyages. But as Vextar read more carefully, he began to notice references that chilled him to his core. Completed installation of the new targeting arrays, Johnson had written in a recent entry. should improve accuracy by 12% when engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Colonel Peterson from the Battleship Division says these same arrays increased their kill rate by 30% during the Omega Sector campaign. The casual mention of Battleship Division made Vextar's patches flicker with alarm. If the USS Defiance was considered a light cruiser by human standards, what did their battleships look like? And what was the Omega Sector campaign that had required such devastating firepower? He searched the database for more information and found references to something called the Human Colonial Defense Force. The organizational chart showed a military structure that dwarfed anything the Zephyrians had ever encountered. Dozens of fleets, hundreds of ships, thousands of personnel, all organized with ruthless efficiency. But it was the equipment lists that truly terrified him. The humans had weapons that the Zephyrians did not even have names for. Plasma lances that could cut through asteroid fields, quantum torpedoes that could destroy targets on a subatomic level, neural disruptors that could incapacitate entire crew complements without damaging their ships, and these were just the weapons systems that Johnson mentioned in passing as routine equipment. Finished recalibrating the point defense grid, another entry read. Had to adjust the targeting parameters after that incident with the Proxima pirates. The new settings should prevent us from accidentally destroying their life support systems. When we're trying to disable their engines, Command prefers prisoners when possible. The phrase accidentally destroying their life support systems was mentioned so casually that it took Vextar several moments to realize what it meant. The humans had weapons so precise that they could choose which systems to destroy on an enemy vessel. They could kill selectively or keep their opponents alive based on their tactical needs. This level of control over life and death was something that most species associated with the gods themselves. Vextar opened another file. This one, containing the personal journal of Sergeant Danny Rodriguez, the ship's cultural specialist. Rodriguez was responsible for preparing briefings about alien species that the USS Defiance might encounter during its missions. His notes about Zephyrian culture were surprisingly accurate and respectful, but buried in his files were references to something called the pacification protocols. These were apparently standard procedures for dealing with hostile, non-aligned civilizations that refused to engage in diplomatic relations. The protocols outlined a step-by-step process for reducing a planet's defensive capabilities while minimizing civilian casualties. The language was clinical and professional, but the implications were terrifying. The humans had developed systematic methods for conquering entire worlds while appearing to be merciful in the process. Phase 1 involves disabling planetary defense networks through targeted electromagnetic pulses, Rodriguez had written in his analysis. Phase 2 focuses on neutralizing military command structures while preserving civilian infrastructure. Phase 3 implements temporary martial law until local authorities can be reorganized under colonial administration guidelines. The most disturbing part was the phrase, while preserving civilian infrastructure. The humans had apparently learned to conquer their enemies while causing minimal damage to the things they wanted to keep. They did not destroy planets out of rage or hatred. They captured them with the same efficiency that a farmer might use to harvest crops. Vextar realized that he was looking at the records of a species that had turned warfare into a science. They studied their enemies with the same dedication that others studied stellar physics. They developed strategies with the same precision that others used to build starships. They planned conquests with the same care that others planned trade routes. And they did it all while maintaining the emotional capacity to grieve for their own losses and show mercy to their defeated enemies. As the ship's chronometer chimed the beginning of another duty cycle, Vextar finally understood why the human data was so disturbing. It was not that the humans were naturally violent or inherently evil. It was that they had somehow managed to combine the efficiency of machines with the wisdom of philosophers and the compassion of healers. The morning shift had begun in the Zephyrian Analysis Center, but Vextar barely noticed the other technicians arriving at their workstations. He had spent the entire night diving deeper into the human database, and each new discovery was more unsettling than the last. His 4 eyes were bloodshot from staring at the screens, but he could not stop reading. The latest section he had opened was labeled Cultural Heritage Archive. and had been compiled by Sergeant Danny Rodriguez for diplomatic purposes. Rodriguez had apparently spent years collecting information about human history, traditions, and social development. At first glance, it seemed like the kind of cultural exchange material that any peaceful species might prepare when meeting new aliens. But as Vextar read through the files, he realized he was looking at something far more disturbing than a simple cultural guide. He was looking at a comprehensive manual on how humans had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing each other. The first document he opened was titled Major Conflicts in Human History. It contained a timeline that stretched back over 5,000 years, listing war after war after war. The Zephyrians had experienced perhaps a dozen significant conflicts in their entire recorded history. Humans seemed to average several major wars per century. But it was not just the number of conflicts that disturbed Vextar. It was the way the conflicts had evolved over time. The earliest wars were simple affairs involving small groups fighting with basic weapons over territory or resources. These seemed normal enough. Most species had similar conflicts in their primitive stages of development. But as human civilization advanced, their wars became more complex and more devastating. They developed something called siege warfare that involved surrounding enemy cities and starving the inhabitants into submission. They created naval battles that turned entire oceans into battlefields. They invented aerial combat that brought warfare to the skies themselves. But the most disturbing evolution was in their weapons technology. Vextar found detailed descriptions of something called Greek fire that could burn on water and was impossible to extinguish. Humans had developed siege engines that could throw massive stones over great distances to destroy city walls. They had created crossbows that could punch through the strongest armor of their time. Each advancement in their technology seemed to be matched by an advancement in their ability to kill more efficiently. The development of gunpowder marked a turning point in human warfare, Rodriguez had written in his analysis. For the first time, individual soldiers could kill enemies from a distance without requiring years of training with traditional weapons. This democratization of lethality fundamentally changed the nature of human conflict. Vextar had to pause and translate that phrase several times before he understood what it meant. Democratization of lethality. The humans had made killing easier and more accessible to their general population. They had turned the ability to take life into something that anyone could do with minimal training. Most galactic species had evolved beyond their violent phases before developing such efficient weapons. The Thorians had become coldly logical before they learned to split atoms. The Valdris had developed collective consciousness before they discovered energy weapons. The crystalline hegemony had achieved perfect harmony before they built their first starships. Humans seem to have developed increasingly sophisticated ways to kill each other right up until the moment they reached the stars. The next section of the archive was even more disturbing. It contained detailed descriptions of something called World War I and World War II. These were conflicts that had involved nearly every human nation on their home planet and had killed millions of their people. The descriptions read like horror stories. Chemical weapons were first used on a large scale during World War I. Rodriguez had documented. Chlorine gas, mustard gas, and phosgene were deployed to kill or disable enemy soldiers. The effects were so horrific that most human nations agreed to ban chemical weapons after the war ended. Vextar noticed the pattern again. Humans would develop weapons so terrible that they would eventually ban themselves from using them. They had created rules against chemical weapons, biological weapons, and targeting civilian populations. But the very existence of these rules proved that humans were capable of such tactics. They had not banned these weapons because they could not make them. They had banned them because they could make them too well. The World War II section contained descriptions of something called strategic bombing that involved destroying entire cities to break enemy morale. Humans had developed weapons that could kill hundreds of thousands of people in single attacks. They had created systematic methods for exterminating entire populations, but they had also developed concepts like war crimes and crimes against humanity. They had created international laws to govern their own behavior during conflicts. They had established courts to judge those who violated these laws. Vextar found himself reading the same passages over and over, trying to understand how a single species could be capable of such contradictions. Humans could design weapons to kill civilians, then create laws to protect those same civilians. They could develop strategies for total war, then establish rules to limit the scope of conflicts. They seemed to be fighting a constant battle against their own capabilities. The archive contained something that made Vextar's tentacles curl with fear. It was a section titled Nuclear Warfare Theory that described weapons capable of destroying entire planets. Humans had actually built thousands of these weapons during something called the Cold War, but they had never used them. According to Rodriguez's notes, humans had spent decades pointing planet-killing weapons at each other while simultaneously developing strategies to prevent their use. They had created something called mutually assured destruction that was designed to make nuclear war so terrible that no one would ever start one. They had solved the problem of having ultimate weapons by making sure that using them would result in their own destruction as well. The Cold War demonstrates humanity's unique approach to existential threats, Rodriguez had written. Rather than abandoning dangerous technologies, humans develop systems to control them. Rather than eliminating weapons of mass destruction, they create deterrent strategies that make their use unthinkable. Vextar realized he was looking at records of a species that had learned to live with the constant possibility of their own extinction. They had weapons that could end their civilization, but they had developed the discipline to never use them. Most species would have destroyed such weapons the moment they realized their potential. Humans had built more of them. The final section of the archive was the most disturbing of all. It contained something called The Art of War, by an ancient human named Sun Tzu. Rodriguez had included this text because it was still studied by human military officers thousands of years after it was written. Vextar began reading the translated text and quickly realized why it had remained relevant for so long. All warfare is based on deception, the ancient human had written. Hence, when able to attack, we must seem unable. When using our forces, we must seem inactive. When we are near, we must make the enemy believe we are far away. When far away, we must make him believe we are near. The text went on to describe strategies for winning battles without fighting them, for defeating enemies by understanding their psychology, and for achieving victory through superior planning rather than superior force. It was a guide to warfare that treated conflict as a mental exercise rather than a physical confrontation. But what disturbed Vextar most was not the content of the ancient text. It was the fact that modern humans still found it useful. Rodriguez had included commentary from current human military academies showing how Sun Tzu's strategies were still being taught to new officers. 21st century humans were learning warfare from a text written over 2,000 years earlier. They had been refining their understanding of conflict for millennia, passing knowledge from generation to generation, building upon centuries of experience in the most systematic way possible. Vextar finally understood what the Zephyrians had encountered. They had met a species that treated warfare as both an art and a science. Humans had spent their entire history learning how to fight more effectively, while simultaneously developing the wisdom to fight more selectively. They were not a species that had evolved beyond violence. They were a species that had evolved to control violence so perfectly that they could use it as a precise tool rather than a blunt instrument. And that precision, Vextar realized, made them far more dangerous than any mindlessly aggressive species could ever be. Admiral Kethavar returned to the analysis chamber just as the station's artificial sun began its daily cycle. His bioluminescent patches were dim with exhaustion, and his normally pristine uniform showed signs of the sleepless night he had spent. Briefing the High Command, the other Zephyrian leaders had reacted to the human data with the same mixture of fascination and terror that had been consuming the analysis team. "Any new discoveries, Chief Analyst?" Kethavar asked as he approached Vextar's workstation. Vextar looked up from his screens, his 4 eyes showing the strain of continuous work. "Yes, Admiral, and I am afraid the news is worse than we initially thought." The Admiral's patches flickered with anxiety. "How much worse?" "I have been studying the files of Major Patricia Lewis, the ship's intelligence officer. Her records contain detailed information about human psychological warfare tactics." Vextar paused, his tentacles trembling, slightly. Admiral, the humans do not just fight to win battles. They fight to break their enemy's will to fight back. Kethvar settled into a nearby chair, his body language showing the weight of accumulated dread. Explain. Vextar manipulated his controls, bringing up a new section of the human database. Major Lewis has compiled extensive studies on what humans call psychological operations, or PSYOPs. These are military strategies designed to influence the thoughts and emotions of enemy forces. The screen filled with diagrams and text that describe tactics most galactic species would consider forms of mental torture. Humans had developed systematic methods for undermining enemy morale, spreading fear among opposing forces, and convincing entire populations to surrender without firing a shot. Listen to this, Vextar said, reading from Lewis's files. Psychological warfare is most effective when it exploits existing fears and doubts within the enemy population. The goal is not to provide new information, but to amplify concerns that already exist. Kethvar's patches turned a sickly yellow color. They study the minds of their enemies to find weaknesses? Worse than that, Admiral. They study the minds of their enemies to create weaknesses where none existed before. Vextar pulled up another document. Major Lewis has prepared detailed psychological profiles of every known alien species, including us. The Admiral leaned forward in his chair. What does she say about Zephyrians? Vextar hesitated before answering. She identifies our bioluminescent communication system as a potential vulnerability. She notes that our emotional states are visible to outside observers, making it difficult for us to conceal fear or uncertainty during negotiations. The implications hit both aliens simultaneously. The humans had been watching their light patterns during their diplomatic meeting, reading their emotional responses like an open book. What the Zephyrians had thought was a friendly first contact had actually been a detailed intelligence-gathering operation. She also notes that our collective decision-making process could be disrupted by targeting key individuals within our command structure. Vextar continued. If certain leaders were eliminated or compromised, our entire military organization might collapse into chaos. Kethvar's patches began flashing rapidly, an involuntary response to extreme stress. They were analyzing our weaknesses while we were discussing trade agreements? It appears so, Admiral. But that is not the most disturbing part of her files. There is more? Vextar opened another section of Lewis's records. She has documented something called demoralization campaigns used in previous human conflicts. These are systematic efforts to convince enemy forces that resistance is futile. The screen displayed case studies from human history showing how psychological warfare had been used to end conflicts with minimal casualties. Humans had learned to defeat their enemies by convincing them that fighting was pointless, rather than by destroying them outright. During their Second World War, humans used radio broadcasts to spread propaganda among enemy troops, Vextar explained. They would broadcast personal messages to specific soldiers, mentioning their families by name and describing the pleasant lives they could have if they surrendered. They researched individual enemy soldiers extensively. They would gather information about soldiers' backgrounds, their families, their personal concerns, and then use that information to craft messages designed to make them want to stop fighting. Kethvar realized he was looking at records of a species that had turned manipulation into a precise science. Most galactic species fought by overwhelming their enemies with superior force. Humans fought by understanding their enemies so completely that they could convince them to defeat themselves. There is more, Admiral, Vextar continued. Major Lewis has prepared what she calls contingency plans for dealing with potentially hostile alien species. Contingency plans? Detailed strategies for subduing various types of alien civilizations based on their psychological profiles. She has identified specific tactics that would be most effective against collective hive minds, individual predator species, and peaceful trading cultures. The screen showed a matrix of alien species types matched with corresponding psychological warfare strategies. For each potential enemy, humans had developed specific methods for exploiting their mental and emotional vulnerabilities. For hive minds, She recommends attacking the connection between individual units and their collective consciousness. For predator species, she suggests making them believe that humans are even more dangerous predators. For peaceful traders, she proposes economic warfare combined with demonstrations of overwhelming military superiority. Kethavar stared at the data, trying to process what he was seeing. They have battle plans for fighting enemies they have never met? Yes, Admiral, and the plans are remarkably sophisticated. She has identified psychological tactics that would work against species based purely on their evolutionary backgrounds and social structures. Vexitar opened another file, this one containing something that made his tentacles recoil in horror. She has also prepared specific strategies for fighting the Zephyrian Empire. The Admiral's patches went completely dark, a sign of shock so severe that he temporarily lost control of his bioluminescent functions. What does she recommend? Disruption of our command hierarchy through targeted elimination of key leaders, followed by psychological warfare designed to exploit our fear of social chaos. She suggests using our own communication systems against us by broadcasting false orders and contradictory information to create confusion among our forces. The plan was devastatingly effective in its simplicity. Humans had identified the Zephyrian reliance on clear command structures and social order, then developed ways to turn those strengths into weaknesses. But Admiral, there is something even more disturbing in her files, Vexitar said, his voice barely above a whisper. What could be worse than detailed plans for our conquest? The fact that she has marked these plans as contingency protocols only, and labeled them use only in case of unprovoked aggression against human interests. Kethavar's patches began to flicker back to life as he processed this information. She has prepared methods for destroying us, but only plans to use them if we attack first? Exactly. The humans have developed the capability to defeat us, but they have also developed the restraint to use that capability only when necessary. Both aliens sat in silence, contemplating the implications. They had encountered a species that could analyze their weaknesses, exploit their fears, and destroy their civilization, but would only do so if they felt threatened. There is one more thing, Admiral, Vexitar said, opening a final file. Major, Lewis has prepared something called an influence operation, designed to peacefully integrate potentially hostile species into human spheres of influence. Peaceful integration? She has identified ways to make other species want to ally with humans voluntarily. Economic incentives, cultural exchanges, technological sharing, and military protection agreements that would make resistance seem both unnecessary and undesirable. The screen showed a comprehensive plan for turning potential enemies into willing allies through a combination of benefits and subtle psychological pressure. It was manipulation on a massive scale, but manipulation designed to create genuine friendship rather than fearful submission. The humans have learned to win wars by making their enemies not want to fight them, Vexitar concluded. They can destroy us, but they would prefer to convince us to join them instead. Admiral Kethavar finally understood the true scope of what they were facing. Humans were not just superior warriors. They were superior psychologists, superior strategists, and superior diplomats all combined into a single species. They had learned to fight battles in the minds of their enemies before those battles ever reached physical combat. And they had learned to win those mental battles so completely that physical combat became unnecessary. It was the most terrifying form of warfare imaginable because it was warfare that did not look like warfare at all. The Great Council Chamber of the Zephyrian High Command had not seen such activity in over a century. Representatives from every major fleet, every border station, and every colonial world had been summoned for an emergency session. The circular chamber buzzed with nervous energy as dozens of alien officials took their places around the massive central table. Admiral Kethavar stood at the head of the assembly, his bioluminescent patches cycling through colors that betrayed his deep anxiety. Behind him, Chief Analyst Vexitar worked frantically at a bank of display screens, preparing the final presentation that would change everything the Zephyrians thought they knew about their place in the galaxy. High Counselor Zeftai called the session to order with a gesture of her primary manipulator arms. The chamber fell silent and every eye turned toward the Admiral. Honored members of the High Command, Kethavar began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. 5 days ago, we completed a routine diplomatic contact with a vessel from the species known as humans. What we discovered during that contact has forced us to completely reevaluate our understanding of galactic civilization. A murmur ran through the assembled officials. First contacts were usually routine affairs involving trade negotiations and cultural exchanges. Nothing about the announcement suggested routine. Chief Analyst Vextar will present our findings, the Admiral continued, stepping aside to give Vextar access to the podium. Vextar's tentacles shook slightly as he activated the main display screen. The image of the USS Defiance appeared, looking harmless enough as it drifted through space. Several council members relaxed visibly, apparently expecting a routine briefing about a new trading partner. This vessel is classified by its builders as a light cruiser designed for reconnaissance and patrol duties, Vextar announced. Our military analysts have concluded that it could single-handedly destroy our entire border fleet. The chamber erupted in shocked exclamations. Council members' bioluminescent patches flashed in patterns of disbelief and alarm. High Counselor Zeftai had to call for order twice before the noise subsided. That assessment is based on detailed scans of the vessel's weapons and defensive systems, Vextar continued, displaying technical specifications that made several military officials gasp in horror. But the ship's firepower is not what makes humans dangerous. He changed the display to show personnel files from the human crew. Ordinary-looking beings who smiled and laughed and seemed to enjoy each other's company. They looked harmless, even friendly. What makes humans dangerous is their minds, Vextar explained. We have spent the past 5 days analyzing their cultural and historical databases. What we found has convinced us that we have encountered a species unlike anything else in the galaxy. The display changed again, showing excerpts from human military history, images of battles, weapons, and conflicts that span thousands of years. The council members watched in growing horror as the scope of human warfare became apparent. Humans have been fighting continuous wars among their own species for over 5,000 years, Vextar announced. They have developed weapons capable of destroying entire planets. They have created strategies for conquering civilizations while minimizing casualties. They have turned warfare into both an art and a science. Fleet Commander Kolvar raised a manipulator arm. If they are so violent, why should we fear them? Violence without wisdom is easily defeated. Vextar's patches flickered with something approaching despair. That is exactly what makes them so terrifying, Commander. They combine extreme violence with extreme wisdom. The display showed excerpts from Dr. Lisa Carter's therapy sessions, Captain Ryan Brooks' personal logs, and Major Patricia Lewis's psychological warfare studies. As the council members read the translated text, their bioluminescent patterns began shifting to colors associated with fear and confusion. They suffer emotional trauma from their own military actions, yet they continue to fight with devastating effectiveness, Vextar explained. They have developed rules to limit their own behavior during warfare because their natural way of fighting was too brutal to be sustainable. They study the psychology of their enemies, not just to defeat them, but to defeat them with minimal bloodshed. High Counselor Zeftai leaned forward in her chair. Are you saying they fight wars to avoid fighting wars? In a sense, yes. They have learned to end conflicts quickly and decisively to prevent prolonged suffering. They have developed weapons so terrible that their enemies surrender rather than face them. They have created psychological strategies that make other species want to ally with them rather than fight them. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. Most galactic species had evolved beyond their violent phases before achieving interstellar travel. Those few that remained aggressive were typically simple predators who relied on brute force and intimidation. Humans represented something entirely new, a species that had refined violence to such a degree that they rarely needed to use it. There is more, Vextar continued, bringing up the final section of his analysis. We discovered something in the ship's maintenance logs that changes everything we thought we understood about their capabilities. The display showed routine reports from Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, the vessel's maintenance supervisor. At first glance, the reports seemed unremarkable. routine system checks, equipment repairs, and supply inventories. But buried in the technical language were references that made Vextar's blood run cold. "Note this entry," he said, highlighting a specific section of text. "Santos writes about weapon systems we are not supposed to have according to the Terran Colonial Accords and experimental equipment that Command does not know about." The council members stared at the text, trying to understand what it meant. "The humans have weapons on their ships that their own government has forbidden them to carry," Vexitar explained. "They have equipment that even their military command structure does not know exists. The vessel we encountered was not operating at full capability." Fleet Commander Kolvar's patches went completely dark. "They were holding back during our encounter?" "Significantly, Commander." Santos makes casual references to neural disruptor arrays, quantum torpedo magazines, and adaptive shield generators that do not appear in any official ship specifications. The crew of the USS Defiance has been modifying their vessel with unauthorized weapon systems. The terrifying implication was clear. The human ship that had already seemed impossibly powerful was actually operating under peacetime restrictions with unofficial modifications that made it even more dangerous than its builders had intended. "But why would their crew risk carrying illegal weapons?" asked Science Counselor Yithmara. Vextar displayed another section of Santos's logs. "Because they expect to encounter situations where their authorized equipment will not be sufficient to protect their crew and complete their mission." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The humans were so accustomed to extreme danger that they routinely violated their own laws to ensure their survival. They prepared for threats so severe that their standard military equipment was considered inadequate. High Counselor Zeftai stood slowly, her bioluminescent patches cycling through patterns of deep contemplation. "What are your recommendations, Admiral?" Admiral Kethvar stepped forward, his patches displaying the formal colors of military urgency. "Complete non-aggression pact with the human species, immediate classification as a civilization-ending threat, and implementation of Protocol 7 diplomatic procedures." A gasp ran through the chamber. Protocol 7 had never been used in Zephyrian history. It was reserved for threats so severe that the survival of their entire species was at stake. "Furthermore," the Admiral continued, "I recommend that we ensure no member of our species ever gives the humans a reason to abandon their moral restraints. We have encountered a species that has learned to limit their own destructive capabilities, out of wisdom and compassion. If they ever decide that such limitations are no longer necessary," he did not need to finish the sentence. Every member of the High Command understood the implications. "Motion to approve all recommendations," High Counselor Zeftai announced. Seconded came the immediate response from Fleet Commander Kolvar. The vote was unanimous. As the council members filed out of the chamber, their bioluminescent patches dim with the weight of what they had learned, Vextar remained at his workstation. He pulled up one final file from the human database, a personal message that Commander Jake Morrison had recorded for his family back on Earth. "Another successful first contact today," Morrison had said, smiling warmly at the camera. "Met some friendly aliens called Zephyrians. They seem like good people. Hopefully this will lead to profitable trade relations and maybe even lasting friendship between our species." Vextar realized that the human commander genuinely meant every word. Morrison wanted peace and friendship with the Zephyrians. He had no hostile intentions toward their people or their civilization, and that perhaps was the most terrifying thing of all. The humans were capable of destroying entire civilizations, but they preferred to make friends instead. They were a species that had weaponized their own restraint, turning mercy into the most powerful weapon in their arsenal.